So today's lecture is on the degradation of biomaterials intended for and in the biological environment. Now, what's interesting about the body is that while we might view it as a pretty benign and mild environment, from a biomaterial perspective, it's actually quite aggressive. Okay, we've adapted various mechanisms over millions of years of evolution to attack foreign substances through the innate and adaptive immune system. In addition to that, we're in quite kind of a harsh, heated, aqueous environment that facilitates the transport of many ionic, oxidative species, cells, that can invade biomaterials and lead to their degradation in vivo. So it's very important that we consider these things when designing biomaterials and biomedical devices. So a few introductory points. Materials are routinely exposed to different degrees of cyclic and periodic stresses, whether it's through the human ambulatory movements and just weight-bearing support systems, or it could also just be through the cardiovascular nature of blood flowing at various shear rates, high, low shear rates. Through these ambulatory movements and cyclic stresses comes abrasion and flexing that take place in the material. And because these materials are subject to an aqueous ionic environment, there are many different ways where the materials can either actively degrade, plasticize, which means soften of the polymers as they swell and absorb water. In addition to absorbing ionic compounds, oxidative compounds, they can also absorb proteins, which themselves have their own degradation mechanisms, particularly on metals that can enhance the corrosion rates of those. Cells, we talked a lot about neutrophils and macrophages. The frustrated macrophages state is one of my favorite things to talk about, how they can secrete oxidizing agents that are intended to break down from an evolutionary standpoint, foreign bacteria and viruses, but in this case, these oxidative species also wreak havoc on materials themselves. Okay, and those are all things that are in a best case scenario found in the body. Of course, we can also have bacteria and yeasts that themselves have their own degradation and corrosion mechanisms. In addition to that, there's also the calcification process, which is intended for bone healing mechanisms, but these themselves can invade biomaterials and cause the calcification of plastics and metals that hinder their effective mechanisms or the ways that they're intended to. So a few things to consider as we go over this lecture is that we want to consider all these mechanisms and think of strategies in which we can create materials that either degrade predictably or at rates that are sort of inconsequential for the lifetime of the implant. If something degrades over the course of 50 years and it's meant to be sort of a 10-year implant, then that's, of course, acceptable. We also want to consider that a lot of materials, very common ones, polyethylene, some polysaccharides, don't quite have as well-defined breakdown mechanisms as other ones do. So we kind of need to understand, how we consider using the materials as we incorporate them into our designs. Let's see. We also need to consider strategies that can mitigate degradation, stabilize materials. Vitamin E is a very commonly one. We'll talk about that when we talk into or discuss gamma radiation, a sterilization mechanism. And then as bad as all these things sound for an implant, we should also consider how we can use these to our advantage, okay? If we could make an implant that could degrade on cue or very predictably, then of course we can start thinking about, say, controlled release drug delivery mechanisms in which the degradation causes the release of the drug. Or say we want to get into tissue engineering. We want to build a matrix that allows cells, stem cells, to seed, differentiate, and grow into kind of healed native tissue only temporarily. And then that matrix degrades over time and allows our body to build its own collagen-based or bone-based matrix that's completely absent of any biomaterial that was originally there in the first place, okay? So it's not all complete disadvantages. It's also advantages that we want to take advantage of. So the key term that we're going to hear about a lot in this lecture, in this chapter, is biodegradation, which is exactly what it sounds. It's the breakdown of material in the environment of a living organism, either through chemical processes or processes brought about through microorganisms or cells that leads to the changes in the physical properties of that device, okay, of that material. All right. A few important things to consider is that we only have limited means of testing degradation in an in vitro or in vivo setting, okay? We have rudimentary methods of trying to accelerate aging and degradation processes, or using results from animal models to statistically project long-term degradation in humans. But it's really difficult to ascertain any sort of meaningful data from that. And ultimately, most of our knowledge of biodegradation from a medical device over the intended lifetime of that device is ascertained through human post-implantation surveillance studies. Okay. Now, there's a number of processes that dictate the degradation of material, and they're kind of divided up into pre-implant processes and then post-implantation processes. So from a pre-implant perspective, there are a lot of operations that come into play here, okay? As we can imagine, the building of the fabrication of the polymer itself, from the synthesis, the pelletizing, once you have the raw pellets, the packaging of them, the storage, their drawing and potential hydration through exposure to humidity levels due to improper packaging. Once you use that polymer and you use injection molding processes, post-molding finishing, cleaning, packaging, and you finally get your final device, then there's the cleaning of the device, the inspecting of it, packaging, sterilization, something we're going to talk about a lot, not only in subsequent chapters, but something here as well. The storage of that, the use in the actual surgical room, and the operation and implantation into the body. All these processes, there's a lot of different aspects that can go wrong, the mishandling of that polymer that lead to or initiate degradation even before it's gone into the body. Now, I mentioned sterilization methods because that's one of the most prominent ways in which a material can degrade before it's even gotten into the body, okay? Something we're going to hear about a lot is gamma irradiation. There are a few other sterilization mechanisms, but this mechanism introduces or has the potential to introduce a lot of oxidative species to an implant, particularly when there's human environments, when there's oxygen present. A prominent polymer that's really susceptible to this is propylene. Another one is PTFE, so they're very susceptible to irradiation degradation mechanisms. And there's some countermeasures that you can introduce there. You can either have inert environments, which are usually in the presence of nitrogen. So in this case, they would have purged air and any water in the air, or oxidative species. And I'll also use antioxidants, okay? It wouldn't be something like pomegranate juice, but vitamin E is a very common one. A lot of materials are made with vitamin E in them. You see this a lot, again, with polypropylene because it's so susceptible to fight off oxidative stresses and oxidative degradation. For post-implant degradation, we can imagine sort of a sequence of steps that occurs to an implant after it's been implanted into the body, okay? The very first one being is that exposed to water. Okay, water facilitates the transfer of everything else, and it's the first thing on the site that can then subsequently bring other components in, like ions that are solubilized in the water, proteins after that, lipids that tend to get a little bit larger than the proteins. So these all kind of attach themselves and initiate contact with the material in those particular orders. Okay, and then once proteins and lipids attach, then cells start to recognize those proteins and start initiating chemical processes that attack the material through chemical agents. Okay, oxidants, enzymes. These are things that neutrophils, that macrophage has, that even components of the adaptive immune response, the T cells have. And one thing that actually works to the advantage of materials is that foreign body capsule that comes at the resolution of the acute inflammatory phase and sort of encapsulates a material. Okay, it used to be that there was a nice open sort of interface for water and ions and proteins to come, and then oxidative components, hydrolysis components. So once you have that capsule around, that's really meant to isolate the foreign body, that in itself hinders further degradation and rapidly slows it down. It slows down the transfer of all those different degradation components that are required from the transfer of ions, the proteins that we discussed further. Now, despite kind of knowing that sort of sequential process, we really don't have any studies that look at that sort of step-by-step mechanism, okay? All of the data that we have and all the analysis on any degradation components all come from endpoint explant studies, okay, where 5-10 years down the line, we've taken an implant out of the body and then discussed its end or analyzed its end state, as opposed to looking at its sequential steps. Now, the analysis of a degraded polymer implant that's been taken out of the body almost always implicates two mechanisms for biodegradation. One would be hydrolysis, and the other would be oxidation. Okay, hydrolysis, as the name implies, has to do with water. Okay, and it's the scission or breakdown of chemicals or polymers due to their interactions, due to the interactions of their functional groups with water. Okay, so it's no surprise here that we're going to be looking for polymers with polar backbones, hydrophilic components, things that are attracted to water in order to interact with them. Okay, so for instance, carbonyls with either oxygen, nitrogen, or sulfur heterochain elements are the ones that are going to be most susceptible to hydrolysis. Okay, so anytime you see double bonded oxygens, you see sulfurs in place, nitrogen, these are all sort of elements that have some polarity to them, thus allowing them to interact with water. Now, among these groups, among carbonyls in general, anhydrides are the one that are most susceptible. So you can see the structure of anhydrides in the bottom left here. We see a lot of double bonded oxygens, single bonded oxygens. So there's a lot of different areas here where you can have polarity and a difference in charge due to these oxygen elements. Okay, followed by anhydrides, we get esters and then carbonates. Actually, I don't have an example of carbonate on here. But it involves a double bond oxygen with two single bonded oxygens on the side, some sort of molecular chain involving that. So whenever you see biomaterials or biomedical devices that incorporate these, it's not due to the mistake of the engineer for thinking of something that has a really high hydrolysis rate. It's because that's their intention, okay? We see these a lot in drug delivery devices, things that we want to degrade and hydrolyze over a fast period of time. So those are the things that attract water. So it seems very natural that items or materials that are resistant to hydrolysis have a lot of the opposite components. Okay, so we want to think hydrocarbons with repeating, highly hydrogenated chains, alkyl groups, aryl groups, halocarbons themselves that involve chlorine or fluorine in them. That's what the X implies here. Sulfones or dimethyl siloxanes. Okay, we have the figure of dimethyl siloxane in the top right here. So common examples of these type of polymers would be polypropylene, polystyrene, PVC, PTFE, which I mentioned earlier, because it's susceptible to oxidative stresses. So after reviewing the chemical structures, a lot of those polymers that are both susceptible and resistant to hydrolysis, we can start making some general characteristics. Okay, so the first two are pretty on the obvious sides, right? So any polymer that has any of those hydrolyzable groups is, of course, going to be susceptible to hydrolysis, and those that have those resistance group, those hydrocarbons and nonpolar backbones, are going to be resistant. Okay, it's because they you either have polar or nonpolar groups, okay? There's also ones where polymers that have a low degree of crystallinity are going to be susceptible to hydrolysis, thus making ones with a high degree of crystallinity more resistant to it, okay? Also, those polymer components that have a low degree of cross-linking are susceptible to hydrolysis, whereas those with a high degree of cross-linking are not, okay? And also ones that have a high amount of surface area to volume ratio, thus allowing more contact with water and the elements that infiltrate the polymer, are going to be more resistant, whereas those that have a geometric shape that has a low surface to volume ratio are going to be more stable. So now we want to consider the processes that introduce hydrolysis. And first we want to consider the state of the body, okay, which is typically described as a homeostatic state, which is the sort of natural equilibrium state of the body at physiological conditions, okay? The body's at 37 degrees centigrade. We pretty much have a buffered pH of 7.4. It's, in the best case scenario, of course, going to be aseptic, so not even counting the introduction of microorganisms at this point. And it's also photoprotective, right? So, of course, UV light can in itself induce degradation, okay? So then as these components start interacting with the materials, again, I talked about that sequence of things. Now we're going to talk about directly how they lead to hydrolysis in itself. All right, so I mentioned the first thing that comes into contact with an implant is water itself. Okay, that's the first thing that's on the site, and everything else that is facilitated by water comes again afterwards. Now, water in itself is, despite the name hydrolysis, in itself a poor catalyst for hydrolysis, okay? It's a lot of the other components that tend to accelerate it that work synergistically with water to induce hydrolysis, right? So the first one being ion-catalyzed hydrolysis, okay? Of course, our body has tons of different types of ions in them: hydrogen atoms, hydroxide atoms, sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium, sulfates, phosphates, carbonates. These are all present in various concentrations in different parts of the body. And they can typically easily penetrate materials, especially ones that tend to take up water. Excuse me. Okay, so things like hydrogels that have a high degree of water absorption are going to be more prone to hydrolysis. And of course, polar compounds, PVC, PTFE, that generally allow less than 2% absorption of water are going to be less ion catalyzed through hydrolysis. Okay, so I think among these, I know phosphate is a particular catalyst for hydrolysis. Then beyond that, as the pH starts changes locally, this is typically the result of inflammatory components, all right, cells that release different acidifying conditions, neutrophils, macrophages in that frustrated state. They themselves start introducing hydrolysis due to changes in pH. Okay, so maybe at 7.4, it won't be ideal, but then as you have more acidic conditions to these cells, it tends to be more acidic than basic. These tend to increase the rate of hydrolysis. Okay, and then from there, and it's labeled fourth because this tend to comes last due to the size of enzymes, would be enzyme catalyzed hydrolysis. Okay, now because of the size of enzymes in comparison to components put out by cells and then also these ions, this tends to be a surface phenomena as opposed to a bulk phenomenon. Okay, so enzymes tend to penetrate materials less so than other components. So it tends to react on the surface as opposed to the bulk. I'd now like to introduce two interesting case studies, if you will. So these are preclinical and also clinical applications and experiences that have kind of given us insight on the consequences of hydrolytic degradation. Okay, so the first example comes in the form of polyester, specifically one called PET, which, now we're testing my memory. I think it's polyethylene tetrathalate, spelled with a PHTH. Could be phthalate or it could be phthalate. I've never been corrected on that, so we'll let it go. So cardiovascular surgeons love this material in part because it's strong, it's a flexible polymer, It's stabilized by a high degree of crystallinity due to the chain rigidity and orientations of the polymer. And it's considered to be biostable, meaning it only has a 50% less deterioration rate over the course of 10 years. Okay, so it's tend to be great for these type of applications. All right, vascular prostheses, arterial patches, valve rings in heart valves. And so by all accounts, when things go good, when things are going well, they tend to last a very long time, right? But surgeons also notice a high degree of failure rates in these in compared to others that had great rates. Okay, so there's definitely some discrepancies in clinical applications. Proposed causes were just structural defects, process handling techniques, and then also hydrolysis. Okay, so they did this PET study in healthy dogs. And some of the dogs developed infections, okay? And these infections brought down the pH to as low as 4.8, which was a pH-induced or catalyzed hydrolytic reaction that significantly increased the speed of hydrolysis, okay? And it caused for this complete loss of mechanical properties on the order of months when it was expected for these processes to last, like I said, over the course of 10 years for a very biostable component. So that's one example of how just a pH-induced or catalyzed hydrolysis can significantly alter the hydrolysis rates in comparison to normal healthy individuals. Another example is a material that is made of a polyimide. So this is the trade name nylon 6, which is polycaproamide. It's a fibrous material containing hydrolyzable amide connecting groups. Because of these groups, nylon 6 has a high tendency to absorb water on the order of 9 to 11%, not quite on the order of hydrogels, but certainly enough where it'd be very predictable that they degrade by ion catalyzed surface and bulk hydrolysis. Okay, a couple examples or a couple rates that they might degrade at is that over the course of 89 days, this material will lose 25% of its tensile strength, and then almost 83% of its tensile strength after 2 years. This was a dog study that was quoted in the book. Now, an example of the kind of failure of this type of device was in this intrauterine contraceptive clinical study. Okay, so it's not a mechanical-based study. It's absolutely a device that's intended to release drugs through degradation and also diffusion. So these were kind of considered acceptable. But what happened was that due to fluid absorption and hydrolysis that induced stress cracking in this contraceptive device, the cracks allowed for microbes and bacterial agents to travel from the vagina to the uterus, thus inducing pelvic inflammatory diseases due to this infection. Okay, so this is kind of one of the cases where it was considered acceptable to have this rate of hydrolysis, but there's unintended consequences of that beyond just the drug delivery that allowed for these type of consequences. So I previously mentioned that there are two mechanisms through which polymers tend to degrade as observed from post-explant studies. Okay, one being hydrolysis, the other being oxidative biodegradation. Okay, oxidative, as the name implies, is the breakdown of molecular functional groups in the presence of oxygen, okay, as opposed to water being through hydrolysis being through water. Now, a lot of the same trends that we saw that makes groups susceptible or resistant to hydrolysis are evident in oxidative biodegradation as well. So group frequency, crystallinity, hydrophobicity, in part due to the ability of water to bring in oxidative species. Those same trends follow oxidative biodegradation. The only difference is whether or not these polymers or components have groups that are themselves susceptible to oxidation themselves. Okay, so classic examples would be branched hydrocarbons, so aliphatic, meaning nonlinear chains of hydrolyzed groups. Aromatic ring neighbors, allylic hydrocarbons, so ones that have double bonds in them that are particularly prone to oxidative reactive groups. Ethers, phenols, aldehydes, these are all groups that themselves are typically susceptible to oxidative stresses, right? So I don't have all the groups labeled out as I did with the hydrolysis groups, The book gives an excellent breakdown of the different structures that are themselves susceptible to oxidative degradation. Oxidative degradation can be mediated by two different mechanisms, one being directed by the host, the other being mediated by the device itself or the environment that it's in. Okay, so examples of direct oxidation by host typically are due to either neutrophils or macrophages, right? So these are cells of the host that are themselves inducing oxidation. To recap from the inflammatory process, neutrophils tend to act in the early stages during acute inflammation, and then macrophages and also monocytes that fuse with macrophages to produce foreign body giant cells act over the course of chronic inflammation, typically the lifetime of a component. So both of these phagocytes give off various oxidative components. The one main precursor is this superoxide anion, which is an O2 charged group that is itself not only is it an oxidative component, but it's also a precursor to many other components. A very common example would be hypochlorite. So this is the same compound that's when we talk about chlorinating pools, we use sodium hypochlorite. Also bleach, the main component is hypochlorite. So the superoxide anion is not only an oxidative component itself, but also a precursor to that. All right, so these are very powerful oxidizers. And one of the main hallmarks of oxidative degradation, biodegradation, is what's called oxidative stress cracking. So these are cracks that start to form kind of on the micro scale due to the attacks from cellular species like these phagocytes, and then tend to propagate over time. Now, what they tend to look like is that they form very rough-walled fissures, meaning there's not a lot of clean cracking, and they're also perpendicular or normal to the stress vectors that are applied to them. Okay, so there's not only an oxidative stress component, but the mechanical and cyclic stresses that are exhibited in these polymers that dictate how these cracks form. All right, this is in contrast to device or environmental mediated oxidation, which is primarily induced by metal ion induced oxidation. So these are ions that themselves are catalysts, metal ions that break, that dissolve into the environment, that are themselves catalysts for oxidative stresses. And they tend to form another type of cracking that's, in contrast to oxidative stress cracking, has no orientation of its crack propagation. So while oxidative stress cracking is normal to the particular stress vectors, in metal ion-induced ones, it's in a randomized pattern. Okay, and then in contrast to the rough-walled fissures, metal ion-induced oxidation has very clean-looking cracks and propagations in it. Okay, and it's found not just at the surface, but both in the bulk and the surface, in contrast to oxidative stress. Because remember, the cells can get within the bulk of a polymer typically. So that tends to happen on the surface, whereas metal ion-induced oxidation is both in the bulk of the material and the surface as well. So I have a couple example of pictures here. So the first one being example of that metal ion-induced ones, right? We see very clean-looking cracks. They're very smooth. We sort of see randomized orientations that don't really go in any particular direction at all. In contrast to the next photo, which is one of oxidative stress cracking, the host-induced one. Okay, so here we have very rough walls that are in a very particular orientation. And if you can imagine, so they're kind of aligned up and down. The normal force vector, this being sort of a screw component, would be sort of in the radial and the normal perpendicular direction of these, right? So just by analyzing the photos, you can kind of get an idea of what's causing the oxidative stress, whether it's metal ion or host-induced, or in contrast, cellular-induced. So we mentioned case studies of bad things happen to these implants. Those pictures, of course, didn't look too great themselves. But of course, as I alluded to earlier in the lecture, they're absolutely examples of degradation in vivo in these polymers and in these biomaterials where we can tune that and use that to our advantage, typically for the purpose of drug delivery. I also mentioned tissue engineering, the building of temporary degradable scaffolds. So in this case, we're going to talk about biodegradable polymers, right? So anything that's biodegradable is a term that we used for polymers that have degradation rates on the order of something that has value for clinical applications, okay? Typically, any polymer that's subject to the physiological conditions that are found in the body will degrade over time, but could be on the order of many decades, well over a lifetime. So it's only those polymers that degrade within this sort of therapeutic or clinically applicable window that we consider biodegradable. So a lot of the factors that influence hydrolysis, and typically all these biodegradable polymers are induced, degradation is induced by hydrolysis as opposed to oxidative degradation. And as I mentioned before, the factors that influence hydrolysis are hydrophobicity. Of course, the more hydrophilic a polymer is, the more it's going to degrade. The crystallinity of that, so crystallinity hinders degradation. The pH, lower pHs tend to induce hydrolysis. And also glass transition temperatures. So things with a higher glass transition temperature degrade at slower rates compared to polymers with lower ones. It's also important to consider that this can be a very dynamic process. So for instance, polymers like PLA, the components of that degrade would be the amorphous regions as opposed to the crystalline regions. So as degradation is ongoing, the polymer is becoming more crystalline and thus degradation slows. Then on the opposite side, because this polymer is giving off lactic acid, glycolic acid in the case of PLGA, the pH is also lowering, which in itself can induce hydrolysis. Right, so there are a lot of factors that can play, and it can become increasingly complex as degradation goes down the line. So classic examples of biodegradable polymers, I mentioned before, polyanhydrides are ones that degrade the fastest. And what's also nice about polyanhydride is that it's a hydrophobic polymer that's easily hydrolyzed. So it kind of sounds counterintuitive, but what's nice about that particular feature is that hydrolysis occurs primarily at the surface in that case because water doesn't penetrate to the bulk of the material. So it degrades fast, but only at the surface. And what's really nice about this is that it results in a zero order release profile. So whenever drugs are incorporated to polyanhydride, they're distributed homogeneously throughout the polymer, but if only the surface is degrading, then the polymer doesn't get released through diffusion, only through degradation. And because it's happening at the surface, it results in that nice, constant, even profile that's in the near zero order drug release profile. And the same thing is exhibited by orthoesters, right? So esters degrade slightly slower rates than polyanhydrides. Polyanhydrides are on the order of days to just weeks, and polyorthoester is a little bit longer than that. But it exhibits the same properties. So it's slightly hydrophobic, so it's more hydrophobic than it is hydrophilic. So it also exhibits the surface erosion profile that results in a near zero order release of drugs that are encapsulated within. In contrast to this, we have the alpha hydroxyl esters. Okay, so classic examples would be POA, PGA, and then their copolymers, PLGA. So these ones have both hydrophilic and hydrophobic tendencies, but they do exhibit bulk erosion as opposed to surface erosion like the previously two that's mentioned. So they do not have classic zero order release profiles. Now, as I alluded to earlier, degradation can take place in different ways. Okay, one being surface erosion or occurring throughout the bulk of the material. Okay, surface erosion is typically common in hydrophobic polymers that themselves are capable of being hydrolytically degraded, ones that are unstable due to hydrolysis. Okay, classic examples, as I just previously described, were anhydrides, PCl, and these are ones where water has trouble penetrating the bulk of the material, so it typically only acts at the surface. Okay. And what's nice about this is that the bulk of the material remains unchanged. So it has the same type of innate material properties throughout the entirety of the degradation process. It's just the geometry might change as that surface gets eroded. So in this kind of picture, you can see examples of that where the intensity of the color relates to the bulk properties, which remain unchanged, yet the size and geometry of it does. And again, what's nice about this, the fact that if this were a drug delivery vehicle and you have drugs homogeneously distributed throughout the polymer, is that only ones that are liberated through surface erosion get released. Okay, so the amount of drug within the bulk of the material doesn't change, and the concentration doesn't change, and this results in a zero order, or at least a near zero order release profile, which, as we discussed in previous lectures, has this type of equation where the change in mass with respect to time being liberated from the material is equal to a constant. Okay, in this case, with the negative term implying that the amount of drug within the polymer is negatively affected. If you were to do it from the perspective of the release media or the body, it would have that positive component. This is in direct contrast to bulk erosion. Okay, this is ones where hydrophilic polymers have the ability to absorb water, and then water and the accompanying ions induce hydrolysis throughout the bulk of the material, not just the surface. Okay, very common in polyesters. That's a classic example. Now, bulk erosion results in changes throughout the bulk of material, right? So material properties change throughout the degradation process. So as indicated in the strength of the color of this material over time, going from left to right, you have a fully intact polymer on the left, and then the surface, the sort of geometric components aren't really changing, but the amount of polymer, the molecular weights, the length of the branches within the polymer matrix are being eroded and reduced, resulting in less structural integrity. So you would not want something that has structural or load-bearing requirements. Okay, from a drug delivery perspective, this would exhibit something perhaps like first order or even second or more complex order release profiles, which in previous lectures we know a first order profile will look something like this, where the change in mass with respect to time is equal to, from the perspective of the drug delivery vehicle, a negative constant that's also proportional to the concentration in itself. So you would integrate this, you get that logarithmic profile, and then the amount of drug being received in the release media or the body itself would just have the same mathematical equation, just as a positive component. So now that we've discussed the degradation mechanisms of polymers, let's move on to degradation of metals in the body, right? So there's four main considerations that we need to take into account when looking at material selections of metals for implants. Okay, one is that we can't make our decision based solely on the stability and the mechanical and physical properties of that metal, right? So oftentimes what attracts us to metals is their high Young's modulus, their high resilience. So they're used a lot in load-bearing applications where polymers might not be the most appropriate choice. But then we also have to consider how they degrade and through what mechanisms in order to make the proper material selection choices. So it's not just based entirely on mechanical and physical properties. We have to consider the degradation mechanisms as well. Another important consideration is that we can't always use these metals in stress-free environments. So there are absolutely cases like bioelectrodes where we want to make use of the high conductivity of metals, but even these aren't stress-free environments. And it's been absolutely well established that mechanical stress plays a role in the degradation of metals and also ceramics as well, something that we don't get as much into in this chapter. A third consideration is that we can't always expect the biological environment to be constant. Okay, despite homeostasis, we don't always have the same exact pH. We don't have the same concentrations of localized ions. These things change in a dynamic fashion all the time throughout the body. And it's very feasible that the degradation metals themselves can further induce changes in the body, right? We already talked about how ions can catalyze hydrolysis of polymers. So if you have a metal implant in conjunction that's built with polymeric components as well, right? So complex implants, the degradation of metal can induce the hydrolysis of that polymer, and the hydrolysis of the polymer can change pHs that this increase the degradation of the metals itself. So you also have to consider the biological environment when designing implants based not just on polymers, but as metal as well. Right? And then a fourth consideration is that the consequences of degradation are really a twofold problem. One is the loss of structural integrity of the implant itself, the corrosion of that metal, the loss of its electrical conductivity, the loss of its structural integrity is the main component to considering the efficacy of that device. Furthermore, you also have to consider how the effect of the degradation products have on the body, right? Very often that the release of metal ions to the body is themselves detrimental to our health, right? We talk about metallosis, and in fact, one of our later case studies on hip implants talks about this, right? The rubbing and abrasive nature of hip implants, which release metal ions, thus inducing local toxicity of the tissue at that site of implantation. Now, the chemistry behind the degradation of metals brings us back to our Chem Foundation courses and even high school courses that talked about oxidation and reduction reactions, right? So redox is something that I always heard about going back to my high school freshman chemistry lectures. So the breakdown of the metal itself occurs at the anode, which is where oxidation takes place, which simply means that the metal is giving up electrons, thus becoming positively charged. Okay, the opposing reaction is reduction that occurs at a cathode. Okay, this is typically where hydrogen in various forms, either it's kind of free gas form in form of H2 or in the form of water, H2O, will receive electrons, thus becoming more negatively charged. Oxygen, on the other hand, usually occurs in the gas form as well and will accept electrons, thus to becoming water in its redox state. Now, it's important to consider that both of these reactions have to occur in equal and simultaneous amounts, all right? Which from our side, from biomaterial engineering, if we can arrest either one of those processes, then we prevent the other one from happening as well, okay? And any imbalance in any of these reactions drives the other side further in order to equal it out. So if somehow the metal ions oxidate and give off electrons, that means there has to be an equal reduction reaction from the cathode side in order to accept those electrons, right? We don't want an imbalance of those electrons in our environment. Right, so any disturbance between these two reactions typically results in further degradation, further breakdown of the metal component. Right, so a very common source of this is that as metals start to give off their ions and give up their electrons, chelators in the form of proteins will attach to these metal ions and then get flushed away from the system, thus creating that imbalance because those ions are no longer there to create that electrochemical balance, right? So in order to right this imbalance, the metal has to degrade further in a process known as sustained corrosion because the body is whisking away these components. Now, there are two broad approaches to combating metal corrosion. The first being the use of what are called noble metals, right? These are examples of platinum, gold, silver, the classic sort of jewelry metals, in part because they're excellent corrosion resistance. Now, some downsides of this is that they have high costs, and also they generally have poor mechanical properties, right? We wouldn't want to have a hip implant that's made of gold, no matter how baller you are, nor silver or platinum. Now, despite this, they're used in a couple different applications, right? Gold is used in dentistry, right? It's easily malleable and it's easily put in place by a dentist at the site at your dentist's office. Silver has antibacterial properties, which in itself is advantageous in those sort of internal and external implant sites. And also platinum and platinum group metals are used in electrodes. They have superior conductivity, much like gold and silver, but also have a little bit higher structural integrity So they're more suitable for these type of applications. The other and perhaps more common way of fighting corrosion is use what's called passivated metals, right? These are metals that have been reacted with oxygen to kind of create this passivating layer, this oxide layer that prevents corrosion on the outside. So of course the classic example would be stainless steel that has that oxide layer on the outside. Going with the stainless steel example, nitric acid is a very common way of promoting this and oxygenating the outside. Other classic metals that are that can be passivated are aluminum, chromium, and titanium. So these ones can produce very strong, very stable oxide layers on the outside. Now, aluminum is not usually done alone due to its toxicity, but it is an important component of titanium alloys. Chromium, for the same reason, is also toxic in itself and also has really poor bulk properties. But is used commonly in cobalt chromium alloys that are used in biomaterial applications. Now, really the rock star of the group is titanium, right? It's used as a pure metal, but also in other alloy forms. It has great mechanical and structural properties, so it can be used in itself or in some of its alloys forms. So that's really of the group that's most commonly used, the passivated metals.